Good afternoon and welcome to this week's BizSmart Lunch and Learn webinar. Our weekly webinars are aimed to provide advice and share knowledge on key business topics and specialist areas. And our host joining me today is BizSmart Select member Paul Rhodes from Green Gorilla Apps, and here to talk about launching a minimum viable product. Before we start the webinar, can I ask you all to use the question mark function on your screen to post any questions that you may have for Paul, and he will do his very best to answer them all at the end of the session. Okay, Paul, thank you, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really nervous for some reason today. I need to calm down. I'm going to talk about pretty much what it says on the tin, launching a minimum viable product. We'll get straight into it. So as always, and my team know this, I'm very into my quotes, and there's no better way to kick off anything. So can you realise that? Sorry. So there's two people I'm going to focus on today. One's called Steve Blank, and one's called Eric Ries, and basically they're two kind of, I won't say founding fathers, but they're kind of two people who are very, from my perspective, intellectual, but also they kind of lecture a lot in startups, and basically why startups fail, and kind of both talk about ways to kind of not avoid failure, but to kind of minimize risk and to kind of do what we're going to talk about today, which is to identify a minimum viable product. So Steve Blank, a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And Eric Ries is the only way to win is to learn faster than anyone else. And we'll talk about that. It doesn't mean necessarily like learn everything there is to know about astronomy and stuff. He's on about how to learn from your customers. And then a startup is a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And I think that's a really good analysis of pretty much where all our customers sit. So who am I? My name's Paul Rhodes. I hate the word director or managing director or anything like that. So I'm the boss of Green Gorilla Apps. We're a team of 5, and we're basically a software development company. So we build web and mobile applications. And I think what we're really passionate about is helping people take their idea all the way through to launch, but try and do it in a way that it's through validated learning, and we'll come on to that. So I thought hopefully this webinar, if anybody would happen to be on the last one, and I know it's available in the archives, is we spent some time looking at the business model canvas, and that's really a good way to kind of almost in a post-it note kind of way map out how your idea is going to make any revenue and what key kind of functions it needs to exist. And it's also a good way to identify like some core strategic opportunities and kind of weigh up which ones to go down. And then also leading into this session is Kevin Brent did a really good webinar on the value proposition, which actually happened to go away and action something on. So thank you, Kevin. So this is really about value creation, this session, and basically how you can get that into the hands of your customer. And then it's really, hopefully, going to talk about how we can test their assumptions, because with any great idea, we tend to be assuming a lot of our end users. And so this is kind of a process, hopefully, you can go through. And what I'll try and do, there's probably a big disclaimer here, is I've probably been a bit naughty in the fact that none of the diagrams or artwork on my own. They're all from Google, and if you just search for MVP, you'll find all the sources. But they're really good examples of basically how we look at minimum viable products. So I'll crack on. So this was a business model canvas from last time, and these are the core components that we looked at how you would in each area define those things. So the big ones really being, for this one, is what we're trying to achieve effectively with the launch of a product is I guess the holy grail is your product market fit, and these fall into the two sections of the business model canvas, the value proposition and the customer segment. So it's trying to get that fit there. So hopefully by the end of this, in about sort of 20 minutes time, I'll have explained just at a very, very high level kind of where this all originates from, which is from Lean, which is a Japanese concept. I think it was the Toyota factory. I should have probably done more historical research, but I'll go into basically what Lean is. And we'll look at, so Steve Blank, who I mentioned earlier, is kind of the godfather of customer development. And then we'll look at Eric Ries, who basically has created something called the Lean Startup. and his kind of product from that is a minimum viable product. And hopefully, I know that not everybody listening will be like, I've got a product idea and I want to launch it. But hopefully we'll see how actually the principles that they suggest are really relevant, I'd argue, to any business. Give you some ideas about how you could get started. And also, hopefully there's some knowledge and some value in here that, even if it's just one thing that you can take away. So hopefully you have those questions. And then, like I touched on, you might have an idea already. A lot of the times we talk to existing service-based businesses who basically are delivering service and they're looking for ways to productize kind of what they're doing and turn it into a mass market scalable business. The other one that we use this a lot for, and in all the stuff that's available, I don't find it written about anywhere, which is basically, it's more than likely that you might have an existing business process that's just too manual, needs to be automated, and we use kind of these principles a lot to look at ways to almost like, I don't want to use the word quick win, but as we go on you'll see how that fits into it. But what's the least that you can develop to give you the maximum returns? And it all goes into like the Pareto principle really of like 80-20. So what we're trying to do throughout the whole of this is identify the 20% of effort we need to put in to really get the maximum returns. It might be that you're literally on the verge of launching a new product and dare I say you haven't gone through this process, so there could be some like good ways to kind of, even, it doesn't matter where you are in the process, you can always apply some of these principles. And then a lot of what I talk about is in the world of startup, and I know that BizSmart helps those that are kind of in adolescent phase, so you're not necessarily startup, but we apply that to that term in our business to kind of not only organisations but also ideas that you might have for new strategic things as well. So I don't want anybody to be deterred by the word startup, because I know it's not a startup webinar. So the concepts we're going to go over are basically lean, customer development, and MVP. And hopefully there's a few slides, but it's going to be more than just a little bit fun. So all of this comes out of, like I said before, lean. So lean's a well-known kind of manufacturing process. And I found this, I mean, this is off Google. So if you put into what is lean into Google, this is kind of the definition that they cite. So lean means creating more value for customers with few resources. A lean organisation understands customer value and focuses its key processes to continually increase it. The ultimate goal is to provide perfect value to the customer through a perfect value creation process that has zero waste. I don't think I've ever read anything so fluently in my life. That's quite good. So that's pretty much it, and hopefully you see from the business model canvas how the value proposition piece and the customer segments really come into play here. And I always like, even if people don't see it, I think one of the best things you can do at the start of anything is to impose some constraints. I think constraints are really good. So when people are trying to get some off the ground or an internal process thing, and it's like, well, there's no deadline, or there's not necessarily even a budget defined yet, I think sometimes putting in, just even the simplest things of putting constraints on resource that are available and budget and time will really help people get to be, well, it's quite a brutal process to say, do we really need that? Yes, we do. And here's why, so this is the resource we need. So that's the origins of it. That's probably Lean covered. So this is Steve Blank's kind of customer development model. And this is like probably the biggest piece of, I'd say for me, over my years in kind of, I guess, product development, this was like a bit of an aha moment, is it? Where it's basically, so on the left, we as a company, and anybody who's trying to, ultimately, when we talk about value proposition, we're talking about the problem. So what are the problems that the customer has or the user? And then ultimately, we're trying to come up with our solutions. And I think one of the challenges in most things that people do is they come up with a solution first without really understanding the problem. And often you don't have a fit. So customer discovery, dare I say it, is all about talking to your customer. So it's one of the things that most people overlook is they don't bother, that's probably a harsh word, they don't think to actually embark upon a continuous process of talking to their customers and iterating. So customer discovery is around identifying your problem and your solution and maximising that fit. It's about your MVP, which we'll come on to, and it's also about the funnel, so the way that you're going to talk to these customers, and that could be through a range of things, like it could be through surveys, it could be through, the best one is always picking up the phone and having a one-to-one conversation, market research, things like that. What happens when you've discovered who your customer is and you think you understand their problem is you then develop your MVP to then go and effectively test your assumptions. So now we get into customer validation. So this is the kind of the second part of MVP, which is like validated learning. So actually finding if you've got your kind of fit with what people's problems are to your solution. And if you achieve that, you end up in customer validation and you end up with a product that's got good market fit. You've got your business model, looking at your business model canvas. You've got, not just have you got a business model canvas defined, at this point it's validated, which means that the ideas you put down about how it would be, how your revenue would be driven, your costing models, things like that have come to fruition. And then obviously your sales and marketing roadmap kicks in. Generally what a lot of people do is they will come up with an idea, they'll fund it, they'll build the product, they go to market, and it becomes a sales and marketing problem. And so it's like, why aren't the sales achieving as much as we should do? Oh, it's a marketing problem, we're not reaching the right audience. Nobody really questioned whether it was the right solution for the problem. And there's a key a principle down the bottom called a pivot. And what this is effectively, imagine that I think that I've got the solution to people. I'm going to come up with a really obscure thing now. For some reason, it's just come into my head with long toenails. So I think I've got a problem, a solution to cure people. If it was a problem, I don't know. I'm really digging myself into a hole here with long toenails. I could go out and I could just build that and deliver it and then try and sell it and market it to those people. Or instead, I could talk to those customers and find out if it was genuinely a problem at all to come up with a solution for. In those conversations and during that customer discovery and validation, what will also happen is I'll get new pieces of information, which actually means that it may be that actually there's not a problem with having long toenails. There's a problem with something, I'm really struggling here, in another area of the foot. So it means that what we do is we take a pivot. So we have the base resources, the base product and everything else, but effectively we pivot. I'm trying to think of a pivot at this point and I cannot think. Caroline's just looking at me really bizarrely. So a pivot is when and it's led through customer discovery, you realise that actually trying to fix a problem you were having, the solution's not the right one, but the problem's still the same. And I've got some graphics coming up that really explain that way better than long toenails and convoluted principles. So I think we're all having fun. That's the main thing. So in terms of customer creation, when you know who your customer is, you've got a validated, you've gone through the discovery, you've got a validated fit, you can then, and the last two are really about properly scaling that. So this is where, if you go to like the world of Silicon Valley that are largely all being built on these principles, you get very small teams, engineering teams, who are constantly trying to validate, they're talking to their customers, and then all of a sudden it scales, and that's when they're in the last two kind of areas of that. So I don't want to talk too much about any one area, so we'll move on, but that's the principle of customer development. So I guess the biggest takeaway from me when I found about this is we were building products for ourselves as well as for customers, and it suddenly struck me that everything was based on assumption. And even when I had spoke to people and said, is this a problem for you, I did it in a way that it was too leading. Like if you talk to people you know, one of the things I learned was if you talk to people you know, they'll tell you what you want to hear. And if you ask people the wrong question, they'll give you the wrong answer. I know it sounds a bit cryptic, but if I say somebody, would this improve it, and I really reveal a feature, then sometimes they'll say yes without exploring the deeper parts of, well, what would you suggest would be an improvement at this point? So it's really about identifying the key features that you need to do to take your whatever it might be, internal process forward. So we'll move on because of time. So the killer question I always ask people, and I think this is where you try and really hammer it down, is it's really important that you understand when you're trying to develop a kind of a lean approach to problem solving, that you look at the big picture. So totally in Stephen Covey's world and stuff like that, you always start with the end in mind, but you need to bring it all back down to what's the number one problem we have today. And if you do that with your product development and you just focus on one problem, I'd be graceful enough to extend to 3, but you must know what the number one problem is is to solve. At that point, we come up with a hypothesis about, if this problem's fixed, and these people will do X, Y, and Z. So if you don't know, or if you have an idea, and you don't know the number one problem it solves, this is where, not saying throw that idea away, this is where MVP and customer validation, the discovery world, massively comes into account. And a pivot would be where you realise that the number one problem you thought people were having, you've got the right sector, you've got the right segments of customers, but actually you've discovered there's another problem that's way bigger. You build your product or your solution to fit that, and that's where you can scale. So hopefully that's the question we should all be asking ourselves. And then I thought I'd have a little bit of fun. So when I was Googling and trying to pretend that I'm an expert in this area, I found out that MVP stands for lots more than just minimum viable product. So be careful what you search for. So basically, it's worth now getting onto. So hopefully, in a short space of time, we've covered off where it comes from in terms of lean. We've got this ingrained understanding that you cannot build a solution for something unless you're talking to your customers. And this is really now the vehicle that we use to then test their assumptions. So imagine I've spoken to a number of customers, nobody knows what the right number of customers is for your product, but when you've spoken to enough customers and you feel you can now start to effectively come up with an experiment, and that's the best way to look at an MVP, is an experiment to test those assumptions. And if you go about building a product in that way, it's very iterative and it's very flexible. And it's about doing it, again, over constraints. So we'd always recommend that your MVP should be built in sort of 4 to 12 weeks, depending on what it is. So the minimum viable product is a key lean concept popularized by Eric Ries. The basic idea is to maximize validated learning for the least amount of effort. After all, why waste effort building out a product without first testing if it's worth it? So everyone likes a donut picture. It's well known in lean circles. So we've got kind of people wanted this, and then over time it would progress to this, but fundamentally this is the main product that solves the problem. And then everything after that is embellishment and features to attract more and more users, but your core thing stands. So if you're able to read the book, I've got some tools and stuff at the end. There's basically 5 key principles of the lean startup movement. So one is that entrepreneurs are everywhere, which simply just means, this is how I interpret it, this has all got a Paul Rhodes disclaimer, that effectively there's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur and come up with ideas. There's now the tools and techniques to enable you to do that, and you don't need an office to do that. You can literally, and it used to be, I'd say you could start a business with a laptop. You can start a business with just a phone now. I don't think you even need a laptop. So this is that kind of thing that has never been a bigger time for ideas and new things. And we're seeing this in huge startup community hubs around the world, which are focused in areas like Silicon Valley and Silicon Roundabout, and even Silicon Canal now in Birmingham. So that's a big piece, just a setting of where the landscape's at. And then also, it's then trying to ground people that entrepreneurship is management, so that you still need discipline and you still need the management processes to drive your innovation. And this is what lean startup is, and this is what customer discovery is. So they're effectively the management tools to do that. Validated learning is the whole principle of talking to your customers and building what they want, not what you want. And then innovation accounting is effectively saying, and if there's any accountants on, it's not my words, this is the words of Eric, but effectively you still fundamentally need to know the boring stuff. So it's critical that you're a metrics-driven business and that you understand what your projections are, but also what your realistic numbers are. And there's a big thing, it's slightly outside of innovation accounting, it probably comes on to the next one, but there's a big thing in the community called vanity metrics. And vanity metrics are the things that you'd kind of publish to get PR and to kind of blag about and stuff. But actually there's core metrics in your business and in your product that are absolutely the key drivers as to whether you're growing or stagnating. So a classic one for us is sign-ups. I'd actually class sign-ups on a new product as being a vanity metric to a degree, because it's not important how many people sign up. It doesn't matter if you've gone out and got 5,000 in 24 hours. What matters is how many customers are using it after X many days or whatever the metric might be. So it's engagement and traction more than anything else. Still amazing to have all those sign-ups, don't knock me, but and then the final one, which is the real crux of MVP, is once you've got your MVP, it's basically you build it, you measure using your defined metrics that you come out with through your business model canvas, and then you're constantly learning and iterating. So you go through these they're called sprints in Agile. You go through these very iterative processes where everything you're doing is based on customer feedback. So that's basically the overriding thing. I found some then, I went off a bit and I found some really good graphics that illustrated everything I've just said. So here it's basically, fundamentally a lot of ideas we talk to potential prospects about, and I won't name any, it's simply they're good ideas, and there is a but there, they don't solve a problem. So if you haven't got a problem, how have you got a solution? And it's kind of like some things are just nice to have, but when you're trying to validate and scale in this way, it's very hard to. And one of the good things, and the things I would say about this process is, what this process does more than anything, it stops you going to market, it stops you even going into development on an idea that doesn't solve a problem. And that's fantastic. So why build something for £100,000 to discover it doesn't work or doesn't get any traction when you can do something for £3,000 and go through a process? So that's a nice little graphic there. I have found more graphics. So the product market fit, honing in on what is the goal of all this. So me trying to put it into my words is the goal of, and this again, I know we're not all startups and I know we're not all trying to launch products, but ultimately is you can use this on an internal process. So what's the fundamental problem? Do we understand the problem and what we're trying to fix? What MVP can we define to go and test our assumptions? Can we launch it in a really short space of time for like minimum effort, going back to lean, and then from then on you're constantly iterating. So whenever we worked on existing streamlining processes, people, they'll start to map out, which is important, the big picture. So we'll have lots of walls full of diagrams of like workflows and stuff, and our approach would be to hone in on one area and to say which one's going to give you the biggest return for your investment at the start. And so it's all about, like, instead of trying to put in a whole new system, and I won't knock central government because they have big problems, but there's a lot of IT systems that you hear about in obviously the headline news. It's kind of 500 million spent on this farming payment system and it failed, or in the NHS. And I know there's lots of things going on as well, but sometimes it's like, well, why aren't you building something so small like an acorn and then iterating from that? That's easy for me to say outside that environment, but so again, it's on the left hand side we've got we want X, which is your users, and then on the right hand side you've got the engineering teams and the IT and the developers and the project managers saying we're going to ship Y, and if there's not a fit there, then basically I don't see how your product can scale. And the reason to do most things is to scale, because then you're going to reach more people and help more people. So again, lots more diagrams coming up. They're trying to iterate that point over. Yeah, they've got a dream at kickoff that they want to have all these different features, and it's exactly how we talk to people on day one. It's we want it to do A, B, and C, and it needs to have all this functionality. And then basically, you kind of strip it all down, and we end up forcing people down the route of where you can only have 3 things, or try and put constraints in. We're still guilty of being in the middle, because unless you talk to the customer, they want the thing on the right, which was basically just to be airborne for a few seconds. And there's lots of these coming up. So another one is like, so then you've got the analogy of what an MVP actually should be, and then you've got how to build it. So people think when we say iterate that you kind of you only build part, and I've kind of done myself with this justice there by saying pick one part of a process. What we would do is look to deliver, and I've got it later on. You don't build a half-assed product, you build half a product. So it's still a fully functioning thing that can test your assumptions. It's just a lot smaller and like a single unit. You build up and build up. So here, this graphic really displays that you're doing it it is iterations of an entire product, and so that's quite a good thing. And then here we've got kind of the key concept. So the core component of Lean Style, which is Eric Ries's methodology, is this build, measure, learn feedback loop, and I found this graphic again. All off Google, none of them are GDAs. I should have put the URLs in. So the first step is figuring out the problem that needs to be solved, and then developing your minimum viable product to begin the process as quickly as possible. So MVPs and lean and everything is about speed. And this is going back to the quote at the very start, that it's all about the person who wins is the person who learns faster. So it's actually, in one argument, it's learning through failure, because in all our experiences and loads of startup stories, as good as your customer development is, it's often that in the first iterations, what you think is completely wrong. So you're still working out what your assumptions are compared to reality. And this is just a nice bit of thing. But the key thing is you're doing it all data-driven. So it's a very scientific approach. So you've got two aspects that appeal to a lot of people. You've got the people side, which is ultimately you're talking to people. And if you're a software team in Bromsgrove and you're trying to build for a mass international market, you can still talk to those users via all the social methods, all the different ways that we do it. You can find the early adopters. So you can have conversations with anybody nowadays around the world. So anybody in your customer segment can be spoken to. And you'll be surprised how willing people are when you just use the words, can you help me? So that drives you back into the kind of scientific approach, which is the numbers and the data and stuff like that. So hopefully that explains it. And then I also have done quite a bit of work into, there's lots of different types of MVP. So let's imagine we've got I should have really, before this, thought of a really good, I'll keep thinking of toenails. I must go home and cut my toenails, I think. I won't carry on with that analogy. So there's different types. So effectively, let's imagine we have got an idea for a product, and we're now working out, well, what should our MVP be? We know that we need to build something to test it, and these different types. So the first two I've actually crossed out. So these are well known in the lean startup world as being types of MVP, but I'd argue that they're not. So the first one is a video. So let's imagine that you've got an idea and you've got your solution. You could create a video that explains to somebody in 60 seconds how you solve that problem. The only reason I would argue it's not really an MVP is because whilst it accurately depicts what you're going to do, it isn't something a user can use and actually engage with. And there's still got to be an element of being a consumer of, or a user of. As a video, we're merely a watcher and we're passive. You want people to, from a tangible sense, touch, feel, and your product. And obviously the MVP process, we're talking a lot here, and I'm guilty of this in software, but this would apply to lots of different things, going back to the donut manufacturing and stuff like that. The landing page, again, for the same reasons above, you can create a landing page, and this was a really common way of getting sign-up. So I could come up with an idea to build a product to solve problem A. I could get the domain name, create a landing page, put all the marketing onto that, tell people how fantastic it is and what it does, and then have a sign up, and then people sign up and it effectively says product launch in 90 days. The problem with that is, again, to me, those first two are like marketing. There's no product for people to handle. You can still do all of that, get 5,000 signups, 10,000 signups, and then you launch your own BP. And if you've not talked to your customers, they've been passive, then you haven't built a product that they've even told you what they want. So then we come on to the final four, which I do class as MVPs, and because it's all about you have an ability to engage and put people into a process. So the first one's called concierge, and these are very popular amongst people who know that the cost to develop the final kind of product is going to be outside their current scope, but they want to see and they want to use all the metrics and properly test, and it's often overlooked. And so concierge MVP is effectively, it appears as an automated system and it's entirely manual. So it could be that effectively I've got some sort of, I don't know, I might have a dating app, and people put in different details. They might put those details into an email, and then ultimately they get a thing back from me and it says, I've found you, Brian, and you'd be perfect together or whatever. That could be an entirely manual process, but what they're doing is they're proving a principle of would people want to do that online or would people want to do that over. I've chosen a really archaic method there, email, but the principle stands. It's a manual thing that pretends to be something else. Piecemeal is when you use existing technologies. So you don't have your own products, but you can basically create a semi-automated thing. So a good one there would be if you had something like a Woo form or some sort of like form capture thing like Google Doc that captured data, put it into something else that already existed, and then did something else with it, and then say email people off through like an Infusionsoft campaign. So you're basically chaining things together to prove your assumptions and that people want the output, and you can have conversations. Single featured is exactly that. It doesn't really need explaining. So if you launched with one single feature that people have to do and just to prove something quickly, and then you've got multi-featured where you go in, and we'd always say that your multi-featured should be no more than 3 or 4, because otherwise it's not an MVP, you're just building an entire product and saying build it and that'll come. I think we're almost done. Yeah, so tools and inspiration, there's lots of books. So there's the lovely Steve Blank, that's actually off a podcast. So he has a weekly podcast. He teaches at MIT, I think it is, and he basically broadcasts kind of that week's sort of learnings. Running Lean is a really good book about how to actually do it. The Lean Startup is Eric's book about the principles and kind of lots of case studies about companies that have dramatically not done this and the reasons why. And effectively, he comes out of a world where he had a product and he built it over 6 months, and they didn't have anybody come. And he was like, well, at the end of the day, we didn't need to build this product with all its bugs and all its layers of code to work out that nobody would come, and that's kind of the starting point of it. And then there's other books off there. The other one, Valued as Proposition Design, is like a secondary book to the Business Model Canvas. So all about problem solving and creating value. Sumo Me is a website that you can sign up to, and anybody can do this with any website. So you embed some code, and it's really about capturing that data, those metrics and stuff that you'd want to do, as is KISS metrics. And then the Startup Owners Manual, I would argue, out of all of them, is the one that really focuses on customer development. And really, it's Steve Blank's book, but it's a big read, but it's a really good, takes you A to Z of how to build one of these companies or one of these products. So then I thought about I've gone through a lot, and I've probably, as much as I would have liked to, I probably, other than give you a high level overview, I've not been able to say, well, here's then an MVP. So I thought I'd do it instead through lessons. So these are just a few slides now of like my personal experiences. So the biggest one is don't build what you think. I think that's the biggest trap we all do. You've got to talk to customers. The other one that I picked up over the years is don't write new features down. So if you go and talk to one person and you have your MVP or your pre-MVP and you tell them what you're thinking, especially when you've got an MVP, they'll say, oh, it'd be great if it had this. And what you end up doing as a product owner is you end up writing down that feature, and then you go and talk to the next person, they tell you what they think, and the next person. So you say you talk to 10 people, you end up with 30 different ideas about where the product should go. The reason I say don't write it down is what we've done now with one of our latest products is we only put things into our roadmap for iterations where it's been like said so much to me that it's now like I know it's the next thing. And it sounds a bit stupid, totally unscientific, but it's, if you write down 30 things, you can't work out what's priority, what's important. If you only hang on to things that keep coming up and bubbling away, you pick that feature and you go and validate that. So it's kind of like your roadmap will emerge almost organically if you don't write things down that everybody says. And then the biggest one I've learned, don't ask leading questions. So I'll confess here, I caused a massive problem with one of our products by going into meetings and saying, and one of the things we're going to be doing is this. And then everybody asked for this feature. And then I went back to my engineering team and said, right, we need to build this. And they quite rightly said, well, what validated learning have we got? Give me the evidence that we should build this. And I said, well, because they told me. And so we went for it, and it was like, well, I'd actually put the seed into everybody's minds that we needed it. When I went then and spoke to new customers and didn't mention that feature, it never ever came up. So don't ask leading questions. Think big and then think small. So we all need to think big. We all need to know where our vision is But ultimately, for MVP, you need to be brutal, and you need to put constraints in place, and you need to do what you can achieve for the minimum amount of effort to test your assumptions. Don't build a cathedral. So if you're thinking big, it's often the case that you'll say, some of the language that we'll hear often is, yeah, but we've got to have that feature, because if we don't have that feature, people won't use it. But I'll say that about 10 things, and you end up with a spec or a brief that's like just too big, and those products, those cathedrals that turn into like massively over-engineered specs will rarely launch, I've found. Biggest one, talk to your customers and your prospects. And then to summarise the actual things we've gone through in terms of the processes. So the simple, tried and tested processes from the trenches, the scientific approach to reduce unknowns. It's all about speed. I can't stress that enough. They're really easy to understand and implement. Hopefully, I know I've skimmed over it, but hopefully you've got some value in that. Guiding principle is build, measure, learn. Don't ignore a pivot. It won't be obvious at sometimes, but the pivot is like the get out clause for a lot of things where you bang your head against the wall and say, why don't people take this? If you go and ask the right questions, you'll discover that there's a bigger problem or there's an alternative solution. And then my favourite one, build half a product, not a half-assed product. And then fact that products fail and startups fail, that's like a given. I've had businesses fail in the past, but the one thing that you can't take away is that you've learned lessons. So you'll know when iterations don't go as you expect, when the metrics don't tell you what you want, as long as you keep true to the whole idea that you're developing it for the customer and going through that cycle, you're learning lessons all the time. So and that's a massive one that basically is a guiding principle, I guess. Obviously, you want to eliminate waste, which is the whole lean thing, and then obviously reiterate here, build what your customers need. So hopefully I've covered off what lean is, what customer development is, and what a minimum viable product is. Hopefully you can see if it's relevant to you, and then how to get started. I guess I haven't answered that one directly. Would be to, if you've got an idea or a process you're trying to solve internally, it would be to talk to users of that system to find out what the real problem is, because get started is to find out the problem you're trying to solve. That's probably the first thing. That's it. I don't know how that is for time.
Brilliant. No, it was great. Thank you very much, Paul. You've got some questions coming through. I'll read out for you. So the first one is from Sarah, and she asks, how do I test my assumptions?
Okay, so I'd say, well, a classic thing is, one, you've got to know clearly who your customer segments are, and then identify people. And it's almost like a good thing is, where do those people hang out? So you can use things like surveys. You can contact, I mean, we've done a thing recently where we contact, if we know that we're going after, say, directors of a certain sector who have this certain problem, we'll literally use LinkedIn, and we'll do an approach over LinkedIn to ask for help and get a one-to-one conversation over the phone. So it's phone calls. Social media is a great one for putting out links to surveys and to get some. And I got one today that was really interesting. There's a company in Wolverhampton who emailed me, and it was a really nice example of how to test your assumptions. So it was literally like, me and Chris, his business partner, we sat around, we're coming up with a new package. Would be really interested in knowing what you think, and you basically go through and you answer this survey. What they're actually doing in that survey is asking some really, really good questions, not to say, is our solution right, but to say, do you have this problem with your marketing? So that was a really good one. So surveys, a lot of it starts off as distance contact, and then what you do is you then filter people through into your kind of, these are like real early adopters who'd be happy to contribute to ideas. But yeah, you've got to talk to your customer segment.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Stuart, and he asks, I have no budget but a good idea, and how do you think I should get started?
Okay, well, no budget and a good idea is probably like 99% of people. So it's a good question. I guess getting started, let's think. So fundamentally, you're solving a problem. Again, you need to go and talk to people about that problem. In terms of the budget problem, there's one of the massive changes over the last 5 years is, actually, if you have a good problem with evidence base that you've got a problem, is you've got access to funding. So I know Kickstarter and crowdfunding platforms now kind of require early stage MVPs. I think Kickstarter now you can't raise funds unless you've got an MVP prototype. But there are other funding platforms that will get you there as well. So if you've got, I mean, ultimately you're in a good place because if you've got a good validated idea, you've got evidence of the problem, already got a user base community of people who are saying that they're interested in your solution, you can then access funds. I know, mate, that sounds really easy, but we're all after traction. Like when you get into angel investment and that, it becomes about traction. But there's other ways to go about that. And there's things like incubators where you can go onto a program, you'll actually get investment funded with you. You give away some equity in your business, but effectively they're another way to take an idea through to market. But they're all going to come down to what's the market and what's the product and what's the solution to the problem. So if you use these principles to answer that, you've then got a good way to start to look at how to address funds. And ultimately, with funding as well, because you want to be building an MVP, like I say, it should be the smallest amount of investment required to start to test those assumptions in the real world. So I don't know if that answers it.
Right, thank you very much. If anyone else has got any more questions, I'll send out a copy of Paul's contact details out to you all later on this afternoon so you can speak to him direct. But thank you again, Paul, for hosting today's webinar. As I said, I'll be sending out presentation and full contact details for Paul very shortly. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great afternoon and that you can join us again same time next week.